If you're not editing your portraits like this, you're doing it all wrong. In today's video, I'm gonna be editing a portrait from start to finish, as well as share some of my secrets that I use to make my portraits pop and stand out from the rest. First thing I go ahead and do is I make sure lens corrections is turned on. Now, I like to turn it on because I want to get rid of that vignette or distortion that you get with some lenses. So you can see if I turn this off, we have a little bit of a vignette. If I turn this on, we get rid of that vignette. There's not too much distortion that it cleaned up. You usually see that distortion with some wider lenses. So I'll turn lens corrections on, and then right now I get into our basic corrections. I want to make sure that my portrait is balanced properly, and that means white balanced correctly and properly exposed before I start tweaking and editing the colors. So typically in the basic correction stage, I'm looking at my highlights, see if I have any blown out areas. I'm looking at my darks to see if I still have detail in my shadows. And I'm looking if my photo is well balanced. So the best way to do that is you look at your histogram. We have our histogram in the top right corner here, and you can see we have our waveform spread out across the entire histogram. That means the photo is well balanced or properly exposed. If I drop my exposure, you can see the histogram is shoved to the left. That means it's too underexposed. And if I have my slider all the way to the right, that means it's too overexposed. So I want to make sure that that is in the middle of the histogram, which for me, that is exactly at 0. Overall, this photo is pretty well balanced. The only thing that I would probably change is if I look at her forehead here, I can drop the highlights just because we're a little bit blown out, and just enough. You don't want to make it look fake. So just enough until we get back some of that detail. And you can see we also got some of that detail back in her arm. Now during this stage, I also like to adjust my white balance and make sure that is in order before I start making my color adjustments, because if you don't do that, it can throw off all your other colors. So sometimes our photo can be too blue, sometimes our photo can be too yellow, and essentially the ideal place you want to be is you want to make those whites actually white. You don't want to have things in your photo that are supposed to be white a different color or have a tint to them. So the best way to do this is to grab the eyedropper tool, and you want to select something in your image that was actually white. So if you're editing a wedding photo, the bride's dress is most likely going to be white. So you would click with the eyedropper tool on her dress to make her dress actually white. In this case of this photo, there really wasn't anything in this photo that was supposed to be white. We were on a basketball court that was painted all different colors, and even though this over here might look like white, it wasn't. It was actually pink. So if I balance to the pink here, you can see that it actually drags the tint slider -35 to fight against that pink and correct it with green, and that's not what we want. Honestly, sometimes when I don't have a white point to white balance to, I'll just do it by eye. White balance is also personal preference. You don't have to always have your whites white. If you want your photo to look a little warmer or a little cool, then you would just drag the temperature slider. Now, once my basic corrections are done, I get right into the color editing process. That is the funnest part of editing, for me at least. And typically what I'll do is I will just throw one of my presets from my ETHEREAL pack. These presets were specifically designed for portraits, truly are one-click edits. So some of my favorites are Ariel, Amelia is good, Megan is good, especially for this photo, and Olivia always looks really, really good. Honestly, for this photo, I would just pick Olivia and I would call this photo done. I would export this, send it to the client, and it only took me 2 minutes, something like that. However, this is a tutorial from start to finish, so I'm gonna wipe this preset, act like I never threw one on there, and I'm going to edit this from start to finish. So after our basic corrections, I go right into our tone curve. Now, most people will use a tone curve just to add contrast. However, I like to go into the red channels, the green channels, and the blue channels and start tweaking those two to really get more color out of the image. So I'll start with just the regular point curve here, And typically, most people will say to do an S curve if you want some more contrast, but I honestly like to look at the photo and see if I need more contrast. Sometimes the photo doesn't need more contrast, so you wouldn't do an S curve. In the case of this photo, I am gonna do an S curve because I can just tell that there's not much definition. I do want the photo to pop a little bit more. It looks a little flat like a raw photo. I'm going to add a little S curve here. I don't want to go too much or else I'm going to blow out these areas again. So I'm going to be mindful of that, probably about right there. So you can tell what a difference this made already. This is the before, this is the after adding a little bit of contrast. And I'm going to go into our red channel here. So I'm adding a point here and a point here. And typically I like adding some more blues into the shadows. So I'm going to grab this here and I'm just going to drag this down, and you can see how that affects our photos. It's adding a little bit more bluish, tealish green into our shadows of our image. So probably right there. I also don't want to affect the color of her hair. So this is just a subtle adjustment before, and this is after. Very subtle. And then I'm going to go up to the top point here, and I'm going to add a little bit of reds into our highlights, into her skin. Very subtle again. Go into the green channel, same thing. I'm going to add a little bit of magenta just to balance what I just did out. I don't want to go too much into the greens, although sometimes the greens do look good. And I'm not going to do anything with the top one. I'll go into the blues, and I will add a little bit of yellow into our shadows, just to kind of give us a little bit more contrast, but fine tune the adjustments that I just made. And I'm going to drop actually the highlights a little bit down to get some yellows into there. So this is before our tone curve adjustments. This is after our tone curve adjustments. Huge difference. I do want to do one thing, and that is go back to my tone curve and just raise our black point a little bit to give us a little bit of that faded look. However, I don't want the faded look to affect the contrast that we just brought to her skin. So I am going to make another point in the middle and just drop this down to give us that contrast back again. So you can see this is after we brought up the black point, and now this is bringing us that contrast back into our photo to make it really punchy. So again, before, after. So after we're done with the tone curve, I'm going to go down to our HSL tab, and this is where we can really fine tune each color. So our red channel is most likely going to affect the skin tones a little bit, her lips, things like that. So if we drag the hue slider all the way to the left, we're making those reds more pinkish. If we drag it all the way to the right, we make those reds more orange. And you can see that changing in her shirt here. And you can also see it changing on her lips here. So we drag this more pink, drag it more orange. And then I can also drag the saturation up. You can really see a big difference on her shirt. And I can also drag the luminance up, make it brighter or darker. Typically, I won't play around with the skin tones that much. If I want to do any crazy coloring, I'll do it with other colors. I don't typically mess around with the colors of skin tones. Same thing with our yellows. Our yellows are going to affect trees, tree leaves, sometimes skin tones. I like the colors where they're at now. I might make it a little bit more orange, the yellows, or I can go really crazy and just turn them more green, really make her pop from the background, which maybe that's what I'll do. One thing I really like doing with the greens, if I don't want them to be super green, I will desaturate them a little bit, and then I'll increase the luminance, and that just brings some more contrast into the back. I go into our blues, our purples, our pinks, our magentas. A lot of the adjustments are very minimal adjustments. I don't make crazy changes to the photos. Again, that is because I properly exposed it from the start, and I white balanced it from the very start. before we even got into the Lightroom. This is all done within camera. That way I don't have to do a lot of work when it comes to Lightroom. So after our HSL adjustments, I dropped down to our color grading tab. Now, color grading is by far my favorite tool. And that is because I can add whatever colors I want into the shadows, into the highlights, into the midtones of our photo. So I like bringing blues into the shadows, bluish, greenish. For this photo here, because we have a lot of greens, I think I'm gonna do around here for our shadows, more subtle, which I think this looks good. If you look right here, the shadow part of her skin, just on the edge, before, after, very, very subtle. For midtones, this is gonna affect our skin tones. So usually I don't correct midtones. If something's looking a little off, then I will go into the midtones and I will add just a little bit more orangish, reddish tones into our midtones, which honestly, this doesn't look bad at all. And add just a little bit of yellow into the highlights. I think it looks really, really good with this photo. Now, I typically don't worry about blending or balance when we're in our color wheels. Sometimes if I'm looking at the photo and maybe I'm like, ooh, I added a little bit too much greens into our shadows. Let's say I did add a little bit too much. Then I can go into the blending and drag it to one side or drag it to the other side to really fine tune what I did. Most often than not, I just grab this and drag it back down to a point where I really like it. Now that we're done with our color grading or our color wheels, I will go down to our color calibration. Grab the hue slider on our blue primary and drag this to the left. Now, with portraits, you don't want to go too crazy because it is going to affect her skin tones, but do it very, very subtle and you get a little bit more color, a little bit more pink and reds into our image. And then I'll go into our greens and I'll typically slide this to the right on the hue scale. Kind of balances out the photo, makes it look a little bit better. And then the reds, I don't really adjust because this affects the skin tones way too much. So before color calibration, after color calibration. So now that we got all of our colors out of the way, this is where I go ahead and start adjusting my sharpness, my grain, anything like that. Get a little bit more creative with the process. So I will go up to our detail tab. Now within the detail tab of Lightroom, there is a slider called masking, and this is a very important slider. You don't want everything to be sharp in the image. So if you leave it at 0, this is essentially just gonna sharpen the entire image. We want to just tackle our subject and sharpen our subject's features. So we'll grab the masking slider, and if you didn't know, you just wanna hold Option if you're on Mac, and we're gonna grab this slider and start dragging it. Everything that is white is going to be affected by the sharpness slider. So we drag this to the right. You can see it starts fine tuning. And essentially all I wanna do is focus on my subject. I don't wanna sharpen any of the background. So this looks about right. And then this is where I'll dial in my sharpness. You can see if I drag it like crazy, her eyes are super, super sharp. If I drag it down, they're actually a little tad bit blurry. I'll do around 45. That looks about right to me. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that our eyes get used to color. So while we're editing, we might think that a color looks good. And then, you know, as we continue editing, we'll look back and we go, ooh, you know what, we don't really like that anymore. Maybe it was a little bit too saturated. So as I was adjusting my sharpness, I was looking a little bit closer at her skin tones and I realized that they're a little bit too saturated. So I'm gonna go back into our HSL tab. This is probably the best way to tackle it. Instead of being under color, I'm gonna click on HSL, and you can click on this little wheel here and just highlight over that area that we think is too much. Orange, it's telling us orange. You know, if we go over here, it's gonna say yellow, but it's saying oranges. So now all I have to do is bring it over to the yellow side a little bit, and then maybe I can drop the saturation just a tad. Now we can scroll up to our clarity, our texture, our dehaze, and start affecting these. When it comes to portraits, adding clarity never works well, and adding texture almost never works well unless you do this. When I'm doing this, I like to soften my subject skin. That way it saves me time from going into Photoshop and skin retouching. As we drop the clarity, it kind of softens her skin. I'll usually drop this to about -20. So you can see what this did. This is before, this is after. And then now I will add just a tiny bit of texture to bring out those little details in her skin. So I'll usually do -20 +10 on texture, or sometimes even +20 on texture. So that's before, that is after. Now we can go down to our grain adjustments. I typically like adding grain to all of my portraits, and I will just slide this until it gets to a point where it looks good. Now this will change depending on the type of portrait it is. If it is a little closer to our subject, a little bit more zoomed in, a little bit more tighter, you will notice the grain a little less. If this was a farther shot, a full body shot, you'll notice the grain a lot more, affecting our subject's skin. What I typically like to do is just use the film grain tool that is within my Ethereal preset pack. This gives me the perfect grain every time because I can use the amount slider. So like I said, if it's a further away shot and it's affecting my shot too much, and I can just drag the amount down, or if I want more, I can drag it up more. So that is it for our sharpening, our clarity, and our grain adjustments. Now we get into actually skin retouching and removing things like pimples and stuff like that. So to do that, we're gonna use our removal tool here, or our spot healing tool, because I honestly hate having to go into Photoshop for every single photo. So if I can do it within Lightroom, it just saves me a lot more time. So I'll zoom into our image here. The nice thing about adding grain is it also masks a lot of the pimples and saves us a lot more work when it comes to skin retouching. For hairs like this, I'm not going to bother removing them. So essentially I'm just in the removal tab here, the content aware remove. And typically this does the trick. You can see that here. The film grain might be a little too much, so I'm gonna grab our amount slider and just dial this back. Now we get into masking, but not regular masking. We're gonna do some creative masking, some secrets. So we'll go up to our masking tool here, click on our brush. One of the best ways that I found to skin retouch faster is go down to the presets here, click on soften skin, zoom in, and just start painting. It'll smoothen the skin, still keep a lot of the texture, just like that. Really fast, and you're good to go. So this is before, this is after. If it's too much, you can drop the amount. However, for this photo, honestly, I don't think I need it, so I'm not gonna use it. Instead, and I'm gonna apply or use one of my masking presets that also comes with my preset pack, and that is SL Glow. Essentially, what this does is it just adds a glow. So I can just paint this glow on from this side because that's where the light is coming from. You obviously want to make it look realistic, and it just adds this nice glow to our image, and it just makes it pop even more. Okay, with just a few adjustments, we have this as our before and this as our after. It's a huge difference. So that's it. That's ready to export and ready to post. One tip that I want to leave you with is pay attention to skin tones. If you're editing a portrait, the subject should be the most important part of that portrait or of that image. So you don't want to mess up with their skin tones and they just look like an Oompa Loompa. So really pay attention to those skin tones. Sometimes it's as simple as leaving the edit, coming back in an hour, taking a break, and looking over it and making sure that the colors still look good. So that's it. That's how I edit my portraits from start to finish. If you found this video helpful, make sure to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this. Also, make sure to go check out my ethereal preset pack that was specifically designed for portraits. That also helps me save tons of time in the editing process. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one.